Tycoon Ty. My powerful boss number 2. His email was clear. Be in my office at 4:30 p.m. Don't be late. The subject line said it all. The body, blank except for his signature. Jackson Stone, CEO, Stone Black Corporation. I stared at my computer clock. 4:27 p.m. The seconds seemed to tick louder than usual, mocking me. Part of me wanted to rebel, walk in late, just to see what he'd do. But Ms. Green, the ever-elusive HR manager, had warned me. Being early was just as bad as being late for Mr. Stone. Since our last encounter, I hadn't seen him once. All my tasks arrived via email, always signed off by Ms. Green. The phone on my desk never rang, and his soundproof office doors offered no hint of what he was doing behind them. Even when I came in an hour early one morning, his doors were closed, as though he'd been working long before sunrise. The only sign of his presence? His sleek BMW, always parked in the same spot. Of course, I couldn't stop thinking about our last meeting. The way he bent me over his desk, the firm control in his actions. And then that vibrator. My vibrator. It was like a forbidden secret we both carried. Unspoken but alive in the space between us. He'd made it clear it wouldn't happen again. But I couldn't shake the feeling. A part of me considered provoking him. Forgetting to call him sir. Making deliberate mistakes in my notes. Anything to break this unbearable silence. But how could I provoke him when he refused to acknowledge me? Maybe this was his game. He crossed the line, then froze out his assistants until they quit or got fired. But I wasn't about to quit. Not when I had a plan. Stone Black had buried its crimes in Bedford, my hometown, leaving devastation in its wake. I took this job to uncover their secrets, and I wasn't leaving until I did. I pictured the moment I exposed him, the fury on his face, and I hated that my body stirred at the thought. Get it together, I muttered under my breath. Suddenly, a hand gripped my shoulder. I screamed, jumping out of my chair and spun around. Jackson Stone. He stood behind me, towering and furious, dressed in shades of black and gray. A pop of crimson, a pocket square, peeked from his suit jacket. His eyes met mine, cold and piercing. I glanced at the clock. 4:31 p.m. Come with me, he said, his voice low, almost a growl. He turned and strode toward his office, the heavy mahogany door swinging shut behind him. My heart pounded as I grabbed my yellow legal pad and pen. Stay calm. Stay calm. Stay calm. Half of me hoped he'd punish me for being late. The other half hoped, well, something else. Adjusting my pencil skirt, I walked through the doors. Mr. Stone sat behind his massive black desk, his attention fixed on a computer screen angled to the side. He waved toward the chair in front of him, and I sat, noticing the seamless design of the desk. The hidden panel, the one concealing the golden bar, was as invisible as ever. Without a word, he turned the screen toward me. Stock prices, graphs, and fluctuating lines filled the display. Stone Black Corporation was there, its value dipping but climbing steadily. What do you see? He asked, his voice breaking the silence. I exhaled slowly. So no punishment for being late? Relief washed over me, though my confusion remained. What was this about? I scanned the list of companies, tech, mining, food. Their prices danced across the screen in waves of ups, downs, and occasional flat lines. Stocks weren't exactly my forte. Honestly, the stock market always made me think of Scrooge McDuck swimming in his money bin. The closest I'd come to real wealth was finding $10 on a bus. Stone Black dipped but is coming back up, sir, I said cautiously. And this? He pointed to a steep dip on another line marked with the acronym SBU. I traced the timeline at the bottom. 3 months ago they had a similar dip and recovered? He frowned, his gaze sharp and assessing. Sir, I added quickly, my pulse speeding up. That was them admitting their solar technology wasn't as good as they claimed, and this is us admitting the same thing, but for different reasons. He turned the screen back around to face him, and then looked at me. Even just sitting there in his chair, he was young and vital. He was strong and he moved silently. I looked down at my notepad and readied my pen, as though I was about to write something down. I couldn't hold his gaze. Already I felt my sex heating against his chair, just being near him. I felt like his scent infused the room and saturated me. Look at me, Delilah, he said, his voice commanding. I swallowed and looked up into his eyes. You're going to be given access to our systems as though you were me. Do you understand? I need you to follow my instructions precisely and without error. You are going to have access to a lot of sensitive material, and I need to know that I can trust you. Can I trust you? I suddenly felt see-through as though I was made of glass. My blouse was sheer white, and I knew he could see my black bra beneath it. I wished I was covered in a suit of armor, rather than having him sitting in front of me asking he could trust me. You can trust me, sir, I said, feeling the lie slip over my tongue like it was made of lead. Good. Now go back to your desk. I have work to do. With a wave of his hand, he dismissed me and started typing on his keyboard. I stood up and walked out. In the polished surfaces in his office on the way out, there were about 6 different views of Mr. Stone. In none of them did he look up at me walking out. With a sinking heart, I left his office, the heavy doors closing behind me. I sat down at my desk and saw I had 2 new emails. The first was from Ms. Green telling me my security access had been upgraded to the top level. I now had access to every single part of Stone Black. It came with 3 pages of various warnings about misusing information, which I skipped over. I saw that it had been sent at 4:32 p.m. They'd upgraded my security rating before Mr. Stone had even asked me if I could be trusted. The second email was from Mr. Stone, and the timestamp showed it arrived a minute ago. There was no subject line. You will handwrite, I will not be late, 100 times and bring it to me at 5 p.m. Do not be late. Lines. He had given me lines. Even as I felt myself rebelling, maybe I'll make a spelling mistake. Maybe I'll take it in at 5:01. I pulled out my yellow pad and started writing. I will not be late. I will not be late. I will not be late. Asterisk. At 5 on the dot, I rapped on the door and waited for Mr. Stone to call me in. And waited. And waited. I stood there for 5 minutes before I decided to push open the door. Mr. Stone sat behind his giant polished desk glaring at me with his blue-green eyes. I have what you want, sir, I said and waved the yellow legal pad. He seemed to snap out of a trance then, and his features softened. Come here, he commanded. I walked in, making sure to keep my eye on where I was going. No way was I going to trip over on the rug in front of him again. Even so, I was slinking just a little and swaying my hips. If this was any other man I'd fallen for at work, I'd be flirting with him in the break room, finding excuses to be around him, touching him lightly on the arm and smiling, brushing my breasts against him oh so accidentally. He held out his hand for the pad. I handed it over, and he looked through the pages. He was actually reading the lines and counting them. Next time, put a number at the beginning of each line, he said and handed the pad back. Next time, he was going to be assigning me lines again, rather than punishing me the way I wanted. I have an important phone call soon. I will need you to listen in and take notes via your intercom. Understand? Yes, sir. He nodded toward the door. I stood up and walked out, unable to stop my hips from swaying. But again, in all the reflections I could see of him, he didn't look up. Asterisk. Half an hour later, and there was no phone call. I thought about heading out for another lap around the internet, but really, nothing interesting had happened in the last 10 minutes that I needed to see. I also had access to every record and file I'd ever want, but there was no way I was going to start browsing before Mr. Stone gave me instructions on what to look for. That would be a guaranteed way to get fired. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. My stomach was already hinting that perhaps it was time for food. Normally I'd be out of the office by 5, and there is this amazing soft pretzel cart halfway home. Just thinking about it made my stomach rumble. I relaxed and let my mind wander. Mr. Stone spanking me. A delicious hot pretzel. The scratched-up antique coffee table I'd bought 3 weeks ago that I planned to varnish. Ms. Green, the phantom HR person. Mr. Stone whispering in my ear that he wanted me. Ms. Neri. I opened my eyes to find Mr. Stone watching me, and I suddenly realized I must have been asleep or on the edge of it. It was after 6. The sun was setting and heavy rain clouds had massed over the city. Your call, I said, trying to straighten clothes and hair at the same time. It was a futile task. My hair had escaped its tie and my skirt had decided to hike itself halfway up my legs. It didn't happen, he said, sounding annoyed. It's time to go home. He stood there watching me as I scrambled to gather my things and turn my computer off. His face was unreadable. Was he waiting for me? Was he just being polite? Once I finally had everything together, I followed him to the elevator, and we stood there in silence waiting for it to arrive. Finally, about 3 eternities later, it arrived and I followed him in. In the confined space, his scent seemed to magnify and sweep over me. I forgot about being hungry, forgot about feeling awkward. What if he just grabbed my hair and forced me down on my knees? Made me open my mouth and unzipped his pants. It's quite late. I will give you a ride home. My mind reassembled the sentence into something far hotter, and it took me a moment to respond properly. It's not far, I'll walk. Most people know better than to turn down a request from their boss. I glanced at his reflection in the elevator doors, but his face was smooth and his gaze level. Was he joking or annoyed? We reached the bottom and the doors opened. He stepped out and I followed him. Then he turned on the spot so quickly I almost ran into him. One last time, Delilah. Come with me. I could barely think straight with the barrage of thoughts going through my mind. The closeness of his body was short-circuiting me. I was getting hot, and between my legs I could feel myself getting wet. I swallowed and looked down at the floor, but caught myself glancing at the front of his black suit pants and the leather of his belt. I closed my eyes. I'll walk. Thank you for the offer. Very well, he said and stepped around me. I heard him enter the elevator and the doors close. I opened my eyes with a sigh of relief and felt myself break out in perspiration. I couldn't control myself around him. I had to remember why I was here. It wasn't to be spanked. It wasn't to be fucked. It wasn't to have him pull me to my knees and make me open my mouth. I shook myself out of that idea, swiped my security card and walked outside, the door locking behind me with a double beep. In time with the final beep, the storm clouds above the city decided to let go. The dark night turned into a dark and wet night instantly. The rain was like a vertical wall of water, and I shivered as the temperature dropped. I turned around and tried to swipe back in, but the digital lock beeped and refused to open. A message scrolled across it. Access denied until 7 a.m. There goes the idea of sitting inside until it cleared up. I looked up and down the street to see if there were any taxis. Not that I had the money to afford one. And traffic would be guaranteed to be bad in this weather, so I'd end up paying double, just to sit in a jam while staying dry. I decided to make a run for it. There were a few trees and around the corner some shops had overhanging roofs. Not that it mattered with the wind that seemed intent on blowing the rain sideways. Okay, 1-2. A black BMW pulled up at the curb in front of me, and the passenger door opened. It was Mr. Stone. Delilah, come with me, he commanded. He was watching me as though he was daring me to say no. I hesitated, and that was enough for him to leap out of his car in the pouring rain and walk towards me. Your suit, I cried out, and then gave another yelp as he bent down and picked me up, throwing me over his shoulder. But, I started to say, and then yelped once more as he swatted me on the rear. I told you to come with me, he said, and swatted me once more before he turned around to face his car. I could see myself in the reflected windows of the stone-black building. My top blouse button had come undone, and I was showing a lot of cleavage. My momentary coolness from stepping outside had vanished now that Mr. Stone had me slung over his shoulder like a caveman. My body was responding to him, and the sting of his hand on my ass was nothing compared to the heat I felt in my pussy. I could feel the strength of his body and his hand on my lower back. Suddenly he strode out into the rain, and I gasped as cold droplets hit my back and neck. They were cold and made even colder by me being so hot. I felt like they'd steam off me like water dripped on a hot frying pan. With no effort at all, as though I weighed next to nothing, he lifted me off his shoulder and lowered me to the ground. I was close to his body, as close as lovers, and I felt the heat from under his suit jacket and the strength of him. He held the door open and smiled at me, the droplets of rain sparkling on his face and darkening his suit. Hop in before this suit is completely destroyed, he said, his eyes twinkling. I swallowed and slid into the car. He closed the door behind me and walked around the front of the car. Between his trip from my door to his, I made myself promise that I wouldn't kiss him, flirt with him, fuck him, or think anything about sex in him. Then he slid into the driver's seat and unbuttoned his suit jacket, and all those promises evaporated. The rain had soaked through his shirt and plastered it against his body. My mouth gaped open as I saw an actual for-real six-pack. I turned back and saw my reflection in the visor mirror. My top button was still undone, and my sheer white shirt hadn't fared well in the rain. I was all cleavage and curves, and at the sudden thought of what his body must be like under that shirt, I saw my pupils dilate in the mirror. "Let's get something to eat," he said and pulled away from the curb. I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, and closed my eyes. Gotta calm down. Gotta calm down. Gotta calm down. Asterisk. We drove for about 10 minutes before I opened my eyes again. Mr. Stone had turned the heater on, and the gentle warmth was doing an excellent job of drying me off. He glanced across at me, and I saw his eyes stray down my body before he looked away. I brought my hand up to finally do up my blouse button, but then stopped. Let him look. I wanted him to. "Are you always so disobedient?" he asked, navigating us through the traffic and pouring rain. Yes, I wanted to say. I'm disobedient. And obedient. I will do what you say. I will disobey you, and you will punish me. Instead, I asked where we were going, and saw his lips twitch with a smirk, even as he narrowed his eyes. Fuck yes, I was disobedient. Leighton, he answered as we came to a stop at a red light. Leighton? As in the most exclusive restaurant in the world and possibly the universe? Celebrities dine there, if they could get in. I looked down at my clothes and suddenly felt too underdressed to even walk past the front door. Maybe I could ask him to take me home or somewhere cheaper. I glanced across at him as we took off again, and immediately rejected the idea. He would take me home if I asked, but I didn't want to go home. I wanted to be with him, around him. Before I could make more small talk and blunder some more, we pulled up at the front entrance to Leighton. Mr. Stone was out of the car in an instant and opening my door for me before I could even straighten my skirt to step out. He held out his hand, and I allowed myself to be pulled up and out onto a red carpet, Mr. Stone taking the time to look me over again. I felt myself blush and let go of his hand. He gave the keys to the blue-jacketed valet and then held out his arm to me. My mantra of don't freak out stuttered to a stop as I realized what he was doing. He was about to walk me down the red carpet of Leighton. I put my bag over my shoulder and my other arm through Mr. Stone's and tried to pretend I was here after the premiere of my new movie. We went inside where the maitre d' smiled and shook Mr. Stone's hand like they were old friends. My mind was already spinning at what was happening when Mr. Stone made a small joke with the maitre d', and I felt like my body was about to float away. Where was I? Did I fall down the rabbit hole? Who was this man who had replaced my boss? We followed the maitre d' into the restaurant and through to our table. I may have been floating in wonder, but small details pushed through. Candles, polished wood, artwork, couples together under low lighting. I saw a man I thought I recognized, and then realized he was an actual movie star. He smiled his $7 million smile at us, and Mr. Stone gave a small nod in return. His companion was a gorgeous brunette with a dress slit down to forever and dark purple eyeshadow. She gazed at me with a look as hungry as the one Mr. Stone had given me earlier. Before we sat down, I buttoned my blouse and tried to fix my skirt again. It seemed intent on riding up, and I felt like all my clothes had shrunk in the rain, or my body was trying to burst out just for Mr. Stone's benefit. Mr. Stone clasped my hand and stepped close to me. You're beautiful, but if you don't stop adjusting your clothes or trying to fix your hair, then I'll take you over my knee right here and smack that ass until it's red. My breath stopped as I looked into his eyes. He was dead serious, but I felt a spark of rebellion inside me light up. They'll throw you out, I answered. He leaned forward until his lips were nearly touching my ear. I own the place, he said and let go of me. He pulled out my chair and I sat down, a little miffed that my challenge had gone nowhere. He sat down and passed me a menu. His face had gone back to what I was starting to think of as Mr. Stone's standard. A cool gaze and no expression. An unreadable mirror. I opened the menu and bit my lip at the prices. Did I want a steak that cost half my month's rent? How about a dessert and bottle of wine that could keep me in Oreos for the next year? It's all on me, Mr. Stone said and held out his hand to me. I was about to put my hand in his when he said, Do you mind if I order for us? I quickly gave him the menu and put my hand on the table, but he smirked at me, and I knew he'd seen. "We'll start with a nice clear white wine," he said and glanced down at my blouse. Then he winked at me, and my insides melted. Asterisk. Once I had a glass of wine behind me, and was sipping the second, I started to relax. Then the food arrived and I suddenly found myself chatting with Mr. Stone, as if this was just any other man on any other date. We had salty edamame beans, using our fingers to split the pods open. Plates appeared and disappeared as more dishes arrived. One was 2 small pieces of tofu and some dark sauce that was about the most delicious thing I'd ever had. As we ate, he asked me about my family and my life before coming to the city. I told him about my 2 sisters and brother, and before I knew it, I was showing him photos of us on my phone. "You're a beautiful family," he said and took a bite of his meal. "Are they still back in Bedford?" I felt my smile falter, but he apparently didn't see it, as he was looking down at his plate. I found myself suddenly racking my brains. Did I tell him I was from Bedford? I asked because years and years ago we used to have an office there. "Closed down now," he added and cut off a piece of duck meat before putting it in his mouth. "It wasn't closed down. It was burned down, and I know that because I was there all those years ago." I'd held the Molotov cocktail in my hand that had done it. Was he playing with me? Did he know everything? I sipped my wine and found my voice again. "Only one sister and my grandmother are still there. Everyone else scattered to the 4 winds, I'm afraid. The town isn't what it used to be." I looked up at him, but he gave no reaction to what I'd said. If he knew anything about what Stone Black had done all those years ago, he wasn't revealing it tonight. Suddenly I felt angry and stupid at the same time. Of course he knew about what his company had done. How could he not? And here I was allowing myself to be seduced by him, allowing him to carry me over his shoulder and smack me on the ass, to forget why I was here. "Why did you leave?" he asked and smiled at me. "My grandfather died," I answered, unable to stop the harsh tone in my voice. "I was left looking after my grandmother until it got too much. She went into a home." "I understand," he said and regarded me with his cool eyes. "What do you mean?" I asked, my fingers clenching around the stem of my wine glass. He looked at me with concern, and then placed his hand on mine. "You're kind, and that is a quality second only to honesty. I knew I made the right choice in asking you to be my assistant. The happiness your family has." At this he waved at my phone. "Is something sorely lacking in my family? I admire you and your sacrifice." He stroked the back of my hand, and went back to eating his meal, as though he hadn't just undone me completely. He seemed sad, and I realized the cold billionaire had a heart in there somewhere. One that had been bruised and hurt so many times that he'd covered it in iron armor. I took a gulp of wine to steady myself, as I felt I was about to cry. No one, not even my happy family, had ever acknowledged me looking after our grandmother. I hadn't been called kind. In fact, one of my sisters had started a huge fight with me when I told her I was moving away to the city. Like I was meant to stay there forever, so I could visit our grandmother. Like it was a reverse game of musical chairs, and I hadn't stood up quick enough, and so I had to stay there for the rest of my life. We'd made up later, but the pain of it still felt raw, and I missed my grandmother terribly, even as she forgot who I was day by day. How did this man who was said to be cold and calculating, see through to the heart of me so easily? Mr. Stone took my hand, and I found myself staring into his eyes. The restaurant vanished, and I felt myself being absorbed into him. He was safe. I felt safe. "Come with me," he said and led me out of there. Asterisk. The car was warm, and we cruised along in comfortable silence through the pouring rain. The storm had only worsened while we'd been at dinner, as though the clouds were intent on dropping an entire ocean on the city. I'd given Mr. Stone my address, and we were following the GPS. I felt the deep comfort of good food, good wine, and getting out of the cold all at once. I wasn't drunk, but I'd had enough wine to relax me. Mr. Stone was calm and quiet as we drove along, seeming to take the terrible weather in his stride. When we were halfway back to my apartment, the GPS beeped and indicated that some power lines were down due to the storm, and an alternate route was required. We slowed to a stop as the GPS updated, the yellow roads turning red one by one, and the time estimate for the trip rising from 20 minutes to 3 hours. "You'll stay with me," Mr. Stone said and turned the car around. It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer. If I had, I would have said yes. Asterisk. I awoke when Mr. Stone turned off the engine and found myself outside a gigantic mansion set on a hill. Before I was properly awake, Mr. Stone opened my door and reached in to lift me out of his car. I instinctively clasped my arm around his neck as he pulled me up against his body. I blinked slowly and then closed my eyes, resting my head against him as he carried me up the stairs. This was ridiculous, but it felt so right. I never wanted it to end. Let him carry me around from place to place forever, just so I could snuggle my head against him. Inside it was warm, and I heard his feet on carpet, and then would before he carried me up a flight of stairs. I opened my eyes at the top as we walked down a long corridor with doors on both sides and a row of chandeliers above us. Like the restaurant, there were artworks all down both walls, and recessed indirect lighting providing a warm glow. All good things come to an end, and this good thing came to the end at the entrance to an extravagant bedroom. There was a beautiful 4-poster bed in the center with 2 dark oak stands on either side. The patterned wallpaper featured tiny roses, and there were flecks of gold throughout it. Mr. Stone waved me in, and for a moment looked so like the maitre d' of Leighton that I giggled. He followed me in and pointed out the bathroom, attached to the bedroom, and the variety of robes available for me. "Please press the intercom if you need anything, and my staff will be happy to oblige," he said and gave a little half bow, a mirror of the maitre d' again. I stepped closer to him, and the smile disappeared from his face. I touched his shirt, felt his hard stomach beneath it. "And what if I want you, Mr. Stone?" I admit it wasn't my best line, but I was coming out of a night that had me a little unbalanced. He took my hand and held it. I could feel the heat of his palms, and I wanted nothing more than him to pull me down on the bed and do whatever he wanted to me. "I don't sleep with girls who can't consent," he said softly, leaning in close. "And when we're not at work, please call me Jackson." "Thank you for letting me stay, Jackson. You're too much of a gentleman," I said. "I'm really not," he said, a strange look coming over his face. "Good night, Delilah." With that, he closed the door and left me. Can't consent? I only had a few glasses of wine, and I'm sleepy, but I'm not so tired I don't know what I'm doing. I looked around the room once more, and then sat down on the bed. The sheets were incredible. They must have been thread count 1,000,000,000. I ran my hands over their softness, and suddenly saw what Mr. Stone Jackson meant. In this luxurious room with its amazing wallpaper, bed and everything else, no ordinary girl could keep her head. I unbuttoned my blouse on the way to the shower, running through the events of the night. What did Jackson mean about not being a gentleman? Asterisk. I woke up in the dead of the night from a dream featuring Mr. Stone front and center. He had been carrying me to a bedroom, except this time, when he got there, he was going to tear my clothes off. I was so relaxed and warm, and then I felt the wetness between my legs. Even when I was asleep, my body wanted him. I rubbed my eyes and wondered what the rules were about touching yourself in your boss's mansion. Just as my fingers were straying down my naked body, I heard a noise down the corridor. It sounded like metal scraping on metal. There was a soft clang as someone set down a heavy metal instrument, and then I heard ice cubes against glass. I slipped out of bed and found the silk robe I worn from the bathroom to the bed. I wrapped it around me and then eased the door open. The corridor was dark with only tiny indirect lights providing any illumination. I padded barefoot towards the door that stood ajar at the end of the corridor, doing my best to be absolutely silent. It was easy given that I was naked except for the silk robe, and it made no sound at all. I reached the door and peered in. The room was dark except for the coals of a fire glowing in a grate. A fire poker stood next to it. That was what I heard. As my eyes adjusted, I saw Mr. Stone was sitting on a chair to the side of the fire, a glass in his hand. And he was looking right at me. "Why don't you come in, Miss Neri?" I cinched the robe around me and pushed the door open as though I had every right to be there. I had been sleeping, and he was the one who was up drinking scotch or whatever. Then again, it was his house. "What are you doing?" I asked him as I walked over, and then I stopped in place, my witty joke about never drinking alone dying in my mouth. Sitting on the table in front of him was a white shirt, my red lipstick mark glowing like the fire. It was the one he'd been wearing the first day I'd toppled into him. I frowned and looked at him, but he wouldn't look at me. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe," he said. He swallowed half his scotch and glanced up at me. He looked like he was about to say something else, but then he just let out a frustrated breath and sat back in his chair. I walked around the lounge with his eyes following my every step. I stopped out of arm's reach and looked down at him. "Why isn't it safe?" I said, trailing my fingers down my body. He followed every touch as I brushed my fingers down my collarbone, across my breasts and down my curves. I saw him look down at the red lips printed on his shirt, and a look of immense pain swept across his face. I want you to punish me," I said, and turned on the spot. The robe was short already, and like my skirt from earlier in the day, it seemed to want to ride up at any moment. I knew he could see the bottom curve of my ass. I faced him, and almost started at the look in his eyes. If I thought he'd looked hungry before now, he looked like he'd consume me whole. I saw he was gripping the arm of the chair with his free hand. The other was around his glass, the ice cubes gently clinking as he breathed heavily. "You have no idea who I am," he said finally. I stepped away from him and around the table closer to the fire. I could feel the heat radiating through the silk robe, and when I looked down, the robe was see-through, lit from behind. I reached down to the edge of the fire and picked up a tiny piece of cold charcoal in my fingers. I brought it up to the robe and smudged a dot over my left nipple. "Oops, I'll have to take this off," I said and slipped out of the robe. It slid to the floor, and then I was there in front of him, completely naked. I threw the coal into the fire and stepped towards him. He had put his drink down and was now clutching the arms of the chair with both hands. All I could hear was his breathing as his eyes roamed up and down my body. I leaned forward and reached out with my hand to press a dot of charcoal against the front of his pants. For a moment I felt his hard cock under my finger, and when I pulled my hand back, he suddenly grabbed my wrist. He stood up, holding my wrist in his hand, a wild look in his eyes. "You'll have to take them off," I whispered. Time stretched out, and I saw he was fighting a battle with himself. Pull me close or push me away. It was just a moment, but it was filled with pressure. And then he suddenly pulled me towards him, his mouth on mine. He wrapped his arm around my back and kissed me like I'd never been kissed before. I melted into him, moaning, and as I opened my lips, our tongues met, hot and wet. He bit my lip, a sudden nip, and with the twinge of pain came more pleasure. He let go of my wrist and cupped my sex, his middle finger almost sliding inside me. The kiss became kisses. On my lips, my neck, up to my ear. He nipped my ear, and the pain wrapped itself in pleasure. It was like a line of fire from my earlobe to his finger in my pussy. "You want this," he said and bit my earlobe again. I looked into his eyes and saw lust, fire, pain. "I want you," I answered, and he pulled me towards him like I weighed nothing. His hands were everywhere all at once. He gripped the back of my neck and tilted my head back, kissing my neck, and then taking a nipple in his mouth. I tried to reach for him, but he pushed my hands away. He twisted each nipple and then put his hot mouth over them. I gasped at the pain and then melted with the pleasure. Somewhere between his kisses and slaps on my ass, his shirt was off, and I was running my hands down his chest and body. He was toned and powerful, and I stroked down his body, across the line where his abs met his hip, and tried to grab for his belt. He pulled my hands away and grabbed my hair in one hand. He pulled off his belt and dropped it to the floor, then took a condom out of his pocket. He released my hair and glared at me with such ferocity that I knew better than to reach for him. I kept my hands at my sides, gasping for my next breath. This seemed to please him, and he smiled briefly before dropping his pants and underwear to the floor. I'd felt it for a moment, imagined it 100 times more, but now his erection was in front of me, hard and throbbing. The tip was wet with pre-cum, and all I wanted was it between my legs. He ripped the condom wrapper open and rolled it down his cock, causing me to moan in anticipation. He reached for my hair and pulled me around the table and over to the lounge. "Turn around and bend over." My body was already half bent over before I had a chance to think about it. All I wanted was to obey and disobey. I bent over and put my hands on the arm on the lounge. My ass was high in the air, and I felt him behind me. "Yes, sir." I said and lost my breath as he impaled me. He slid into me, his thick cock stretching me out. I felt a shock to the core of me, and then another as he withdrew and pushed forward again. "You want this?" he said and smacked me on the ass harder than he'd ever done before. His palm felt like fire and tears came to my eyes. The rush of pleasure that followed was nearly unbearable. "You want this? Answer me." He smacked my ass again, and then again while he pounded in and out of me. His fingers dug into my skin and each violent thrust shocked through my body. The pain and pleasure joined and spread over my body, electric fire running up my legs, spreading out from my core. "Yes, I want this," I cried out, and he slapped my ass again. A fresh wave of tears came at the pain. "I want this, sir," he said, his voice thick and his breath fast. "Yes, yes, yes," I moaned, feeling my orgasm building. It was roaring in from all parts of my body. He slapped me again and I screamed in pleasure. "Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir." I babbled before all words left me, and I was moaning as his fingers dug into my hips and pulled me back and forth. I was helpless before him, barely able to keep my grip on the lounge arm as he fucked me. He hit me one more time, and it tipped me over the edge. The roaring fire burst across me, and my legs went weak as my pussy convulsed around him. I heard him groan and his breath speed up, and then I felt him come, his hard cock throbbing inside of me. I squeezed muscles that had been out of my control, and heard him take in a sharp breath. "Delilah," he said, trying to catch his breath. I felt a droplet of sweat land on my back before he pulled himself out of me, and I sighed with pleasure. Asterisk. I heard Mr. Stone remove the condom and dispose of it while I stood there with my throbbing ass in the air, holding on to the side of the lounge. I closed my eyes, enjoying the fading echoes of warmth rippling through my body. I didn't hear him put his clothes on, so when he gently touched me on the back, I started when I opened my eyes. I stood up and took the robe, wrapping it around me. He looked down at the charcoal mark over my left nipple and smiled at me. In the dull glow of the fireplace, everything was in shades of red and black. He stepped closer, put his arm around me, and gently traced a finger over my throbbing ass. "You want this?" This time it was a question, not a command. My ass was hurting, the skin tingling, but there was still a deep pleasure tied to it. I'd never experienced anything like this before. "I want this, sir." As I said it, I knew it was more true than anything I'd ever said to any man in my life. I wanted this. I wanted him. I wanted him beyond all measure of control. Mr. Stone kissed me and pulled back, his hands on my hips. I held his forearms and looked into his beautiful eyes. "I need to trust you. I need to know you trust me. If we are to continue." "I trust you," I said, stepping closer to him and kissing him back even as I felt my stomach sink. Twice now he'd asked if he could trust me, and twice now I'd lied. If he'd noticed my deception, he said nothing, and somehow this made it all the worse. But I simply couldn't repeat my lie again. What did he mean continue? Continue fucking? Continue as boss and assistant? "Come with me," he said and took me by the hand. He led me to the corner of the room and opened a door that was so well disguised as part of the wall, I'd have never found it even in broad daylight. A small light came on below us, revealing a short corridor ending with a large black door. Mr. Stone pulled me down the corridor and then removed a small black key from his pocket. He inserted it into the door, which unlocked with a soft click. The door swung open, and Mr. Stone pulled me inside into the darkness. As we stepped in, indirect lights turned on and illuminated the huge room. As the light brightened, I tried to take in what I was seeing. There were soft ropes of varying lengths down one wall and chains on the other. Between them were tables of various shapes and sizes, and something that looked like a wooden barrel with spokes set all around it. There were chains ending in leather cuffs hanging from the ceiling and cases set into the walls holding dildos, vibrators, handcuffs, and other sex toys I'd never seen before. The lights on the far wall flickered to life, revealing whips, a variety of riding crops, paddles, and dark red clothes pegs. I took it all in, my mind reeling. It was a dungeon, one built by a man who needed bondage as part of his life, built by a man who wanted to be in control. I turned to Mr. Stone and saw he had been watching me, judging my reaction. "I need to trust you. I need you to trust me. I am dominant. In business, in life, and in bed. If you are going to be with me, then you need to be submissive." I looked around the room and tried to calm myself, but it was no use. My skin was still tingling from before, and everywhere I looked was something else that set my imagination ablaze. Should I just walk out? I was at stone black to uncover their crimes and then show them to the world. Could I do that now? Was I giving up everything I believed in for some man? Some dark and damaged man? I looked at Mr. Stone and saw the mask was gone. He had taken off a small piece of armor and risked everything by bringing me here. I saw that what I said in this moment would bring us together or smash his heart so hard he'd never reveal himself again. Do you trust me? Can I trust you? He took my hand and I stepped closer to him. I trust you. You can trust me. He kissed me on the cheek, and I realized what I'd just said was completely true. I couldn't betray him. Not now. Come with me, he said and pulled me along behind him. I caught a glimpse of my face in a mirror set into the wall. I saw a girl swept up in the moment. I saw a girl lying to her boss. I saw a girl lying to herself.